My name is Rory McCarthy. I'm a fellow at Magdalen College, Oxford, and I want to talk to you today about some of the research that I did for my new book, which is about the emergence and the development of Tunisia's main Islamist movement, the Nahda movement. I want to start by describing a scene to you. So it's May 2016. This is a hotel ballroom in Hammamet, which is a beautiful beach resort in Tunisia, and the Islamist movement Nahda is holding its 10th Congress. So hundreds of members of the movement have come together to discuss how they've managed, since the fall of the authoritarian regime 5 years earlier, but they're also here to chart a decisive new strategy for the future. And they've been holding months of meetings and workshops in local branches of the movement across the country to prepare for this event. And at this meeting, the members of Nahda, they call themselves Nahdawis, they voted by a large majority to transform the movement into a political party that would, for the first time, formally separate itself from religious, social and cultural activism. So this is not quite a division between political party and religious movement that we've seen with Islamists elsewhere in the region. It's the movement becoming a political party. And all other activism is supposed to happen elsewhere. So Rashid Ghannouchi, who is shown there at the top of the picture, the founder, leader of the movement, describes this to his Congress as a functional specialization. He says it's the latest stage in the evolution of Nahda. And then he tells a French newspaper, "We are leaving political Islam to enter into Muslim democracy. We are Muslim Democrats who no longer call for political Islam." So this is what I want to talk about today. This is the problem that shapes my book. How do we explain the transformation of this Islamist project? Right, because this is really a movement that's transformed itself over the last 40 years. It emerged in the 1970s as a religious preaching circle. It was heavily influenced by ideas from the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, also from the preaching activism of the Tablighi Jamaat, who came from South Asia. And when it first announced its political ambitions in 1981, it talked about a comprehensive conception of Islam. This is an audacious project. The idea was to bring the political and the religious together in one vision. This word comprehensive is something that really characterizes Islamist movements across the region. The movement was heavily repressed in the 1980s, and in the early 1990s it was effectively dismantled. It almost disappeared for 20 years. And then after the Arab Spring in 2011, after the fall of Ben Ali, the movement re-emerged. It was quickly legalized, and it won the first elections in October 2011. And then you get to this conference in 2016, where they talk about a functional specialization in political work, in which they say political work is now separate from preaching work. And these are the terms they use: political work and preaching work. They say they're not secularizing the movement, but this is a big reduction in their ambition. The movement describes it as a straightforward evolution from a religious movement to an opposition party to a party of government. But I want to suggest to you that it's not that straightforward. So the way I see this is that it's a question about where political identities come from. It's a question about how political parties are formed. It's a question about how a social, a cultural, and a religious identity can become a formal political identity structured around a political party. I'm interested here in the way that the rules and the boundaries of a political system shape a movement. So I'm thinking about not just the effect of taking part in a political system, but also the effect of repression. What effect does that have on a movement? And I'm interested in the internal negotiations that go on inside a movement like this when they're trying to construct this political identity, and what the consequences of those debates are, and what the costs of these negotiations are. Okay, so how can we think about answering this question? How can we think about how movements become political parties? So there's been lots of work on this in other contexts, right? So these questions were asked about socialist movements and Christian Democrat movements in Europe in the 19th century. Those are the key works. And what these scholars found is that if there are rewards for political participation, then social movements or subcultural movements can become political parties, but they often tend to downplay their ideology. So whether it's a class salience or a religious salience, they downplay it in order to search for voters beyond the core electorate, right? They're looking for a wider array of supporters. So that's something, but if we think about Europe in the 20th century, the context is quite different. You have the violence of 2 world wars, you have a society that's becoming increasingly secular, and it's generally less authoritarian than the contemporary Middle East. So how can we answer this question, or how has it been tackled in terms of the Middle East? So one approach has been to say, well, there's something exceptional about Tunisia, right? That there's something unusual about it. In fact, there's even been a book written recently called The Arab Anomaly, Tunisia, the Arab Anomaly. And this argument says that there's something unusual about Tunisia. There's something special. It has a usable past, as someone wrote. In other words, it's always been a bit more moderate or a bit more secular than other countries in the region. It was the first to ban slavery. In the 19th century, it was the first to write a constitution. I don't find that a particularly useful argument, because actually I think that contemporary Tunisian history is pretty comparable to the rest of the region, right? After independence, there was a single mass party regime. There was a system of repressive semi-authoritarianism. And I'm going to show you that the Islamists in Tunisia are having exactly the same debates as Islamists elsewhere in the region. Okay, so I don't think this idea of Tunisia as an exception is particularly useful. Another way to think about it is to say, well, maybe these changes within Nahda are all to do with the changing political context after the Arab Spring, okay? Because a lot's changed. Tunisia is now effectively a democracy. There are many more political opportunities on offer. And of course, this affects how people do politics. There's also been a process of bargaining with the old political elite, the former regime elite. That also affects how Ennahda operates. So I think this is quite useful, but if we only focus on what's happened after 2011, then it means we're overlooking a long history of internal debate and discussion within the movement that's been going on for decades. And then the last way of thinking about it is to say, well, is this something called post-Islamism, right? Are they going beyond the Islamism of the past? Okay, and I'm sure you've read about this, so you can think about post-Islamism either as a historical condition, which is how Olivier Roy talks about it. He talks about it as if there's been a sort of failure of, or an exhaustion of the revolutionary zeal in an Islamist movement. They failed to capture the state, and they've become something different. Or you can think about it, as Asef Bayat does, as a conceptual rethinking where Islamists are much less interested in telling people what duties they should stick to, and they're more interested in religiosity and rights, encouraging a different sense of what it means to be Islamist in the modern world. So I think that's partly true in the case of Ennahda, but what I'm going to show you is a bit more prosaic than that. We don't quite get to religiosity and rights. And in my research, I take a different angle. And I think about the long history of internal debates and politicization that's been happening within Ennahda well before 2011. And I'm going to argue that the decision to specialize as a political party in 2016 was the product of a long internal debate about the salience of political ambitions versus preaching ambitions within the movement. So in 2016, when the movement said it was no longer Islamist, when it said they were Muslim Democrats, this is the movement's admitting in public that it can no longer fuse together its political work with its preaching work. Okay, so before I explain what I mean by this argument, I want to just say something about how I think we approach the study of Islamism. We as scholars approach the study of Islamism. And my impression is that we are fascinated by Islamist leaders and ideologues as if they as individuals somehow embody monolithic movements. But this doesn't allow for the possibility that Islamist organizations are more fragmented than they appear. So we tend to interview Islamist leaders like these two. We tend to study their statements. We tend to look at their public performances. But we pay much less attention to how their words are received and understood by ordinary members of the movement, and how those perceptions might change over time. And I think this is particularly the case when you look at Nahda, because of Rashid Ghannouchi, the founder of the movement, who has an enduring and charismatic role. He's the person that people tend to write about more than anything. And that means we tend to think of Nahda in the way that he presents it, which is if it's a unified movement that's always pursued a political project aimed at state power. But we don't ask, well, how did that become the priority? And was that path to politicization seamless? Was it straightforward? And do ordinary members think of it in the same way as the leadership? And I think that if we overlook these internal questions, these internal dynamics, we're going to miss a lot about the way that ideas are transmitted from the leadership of a movement down to the base, and how those ideas are contested and negotiated. So I'm taking an alternative approach here, and I'm thinking about the lived experience of Islamist activism. So I'm interested in how individuals came to the movement, what meanings they gave to their activism, and how and why those meanings might have changed over time. And I want to take seriously the experiences of non-elite members of the movement, of ordinary members of the movement, to look at how Islamist activism operates offstage, not in these big public performances, but offstage in smaller communities, beyond the most visible formal politics of movements and their leaders. And I take this idea that the way that meanings are made in a social movement is constitutive. It helps form the movement. And if you look inside the movement, you soon find that there are competing narratives of meaning, right? People disagree about what it means to be a member of the movement. And that disagreement, those debates, produce strategic and intellectual adaptations. They change the movement. They change what it stands for. So I'm not saying that the views of ordinary members of the movement are somehow more important than the views of their leadership. I am saying that there is a lot to learn from changing our perspective away from this to study the solidarities that emerge from informal, value-centered, grassroots activism, and to map how those solidarities might change over time. So the book that I wrote is a political ethnography, basically, of the movement. It's based on fieldwork. I spent a year doing fieldwork in one city in Tunisia, the city of Sousse, which is in that green area, which is the Sahel, which is the kind of wealthy coastal region of Sousse. Sousse is the third largest city in Tunisia, has about 200,000 people in it. I started my research there in 2013. I knew one person in the city. He was a member of Nahda. He'd been a prisoner for 8 years, and he found me somewhere to live, and he introduced me to his friends in the movement, and they introduced me to others. And in the end, I spent time with more than 100 current and former members of the movement. So these were ordinary members. These were people who ran their local bureaus. They were people who ran the regional bureaus in Sousse. And I hung out in their offices, and I went to their meetings and their rallies and their weddings. And I used archival sources as well. I used party documents, I used court transcripts, memoirs that people had written, newspaper archives. There's some Islamist newspapers that they were writing for. So if you know anything about Tunisia, you'd know that Sousse is quite an odd place to choose to study Islamism, right? Because Sousse is a city that produced the secular political elite in Tunisia. Right? A lot of the prime ministers, a lot of the senior politicians, secular politicians, have come from Sousse. Ben Ali himself came from Sousse. But since the 1970s, the Islamists were meeting in the Great Mosque in Sousse. In fact, in 1973, Ghannouchi and some of his colleagues were briefly arrested there for holding a meeting. So actually there's been a long history of Islamist activism in the city going back to the 70s. And in 1989, just after Ben Ali came to power, there was an election. The Islamists were allowed to take part in the election, at least as independents. And in Sousse, they won 27% of the vote. I mean, that's remarkable given that this was an authoritarian regime. These were rigged elections. So the government was rigging the elections to make sure the ruling party would win. And still the Islamists won more than a quarter of the vote. So that, I think, shows that even in the late 80s, there was already a strong Islamist base in the city. And I wanted to think about where that presence, where that urban presence came from and how it might have changed over time. So let's go back to the question that I asked at the beginning. How can I explain the way this movement has transformed over the last 40 years? So the first point I want to make is that there's been this tension between political and preaching ambitions. So I said at the beginning that they talked about this comprehensive conception of Islam. So they presented political and religious ambitions as if they were fused together, as if they were cohesive. But in fact, the relationship between the two within the movement has always been conflicted, and it's now proved irreconcilable. We tend to think of the dilemmas facing the movement as new to the situation after 2011, because there have been new political opportunities opened, and that changes the way political parties operate. It's changed the way all political parties in Tunisia operate. But I think, as I said, that overlooks this long history of debate within the movement going back many years. The tension between political and preaching ambitions was there from the very beginning. Why do we miss this? Because I think we focus too often on the leadership of a movement and the formal contest between the leadership of the movement and the authoritarian regime. But that's not the only arena of struggle, right? These movements are not just obsessed with the state. They're not just obsessed with being in power. They engage in politics much more widely. Especially in the Middle East, I think, because the modern nation state is very intrusive in the Middle East. It means that even religious, social and cultural activism becomes political. Why? Because the state is trying to control it, it's trying to regulate it. So if you want to do something the state doesn't authorize, you are engaging in a political act. Another problem is that we often think about Islamist mobilization as if it's explained somehow by economic grievances, right? As if there's some kind of structural strain that's producing this quest for self-identity that then becomes Islamism. This is something that you read in the literature all the time. But it doesn't explain why some people at moments of economic crisis might become Islamists and some people might become leftists or trade unionists. It doesn't explain why people might continue their activism well beyond an economic crisis. And it treats religion as if it just depends on other grievances, social and economic grievances. As if it's just a vocabulary that expresses those grievances. And I think we tend to downplay the significance of faith and belief and the role that they play in creating identities and values and practices. So, for example, one account of Nahda says that by the end of the 1980s, the movement was no longer religious in any strict sense of the term. But I think if you look at the local level, that's just not true. I suggest that we should take seriously this offstage local activism. And if we do that, we find a completely different set of mobilizations. So this is about how an Islamist movement uses religious resources. So, in June 1981, the movement held its first public press conference. That's Ghannouchi in the middle, that's kind of younger Ghannouchi. And this is where they announced their first political program. They create the Islamic Tendency Movement, the MTI. They criticized the one-party state that exists at that time under Habib Bourguiba. They want pluralist political competition. They want to be recognized and to take part in politics. And they talk about establishing an Islamic state, although that's always more of an aspiration than anything. There are very few details about what that might mean. And they talk about democratic goals, and and how much they want to be admitted into the political process. So Ghannouchi later said, "We drank the cup of democracy in one gulp back in the 1980s, while other Islamists have taken it sip by sip." So in other words, the things they were asking for in 1981, democracy, pluralist political system, other Islamists were not yet asking for. It wasn't until the 90s that the Muslim Brotherhood began to ask for this in Egypt. But even at this point, this formal political work that they're talking about here is not the only goal of the movement. In fact, in their literature, they say that their first goals are cultural, social, and religious before they are political. And when the movement first emerged in public like this, there'd already been very strong debates about whether this was the right course to take. So a lot of people said we shouldn't become a political party because we're effectively recognizing the political system that already exists. We're effectively accepting the political system that exists. And it was only by a very close vote that they took the decision to hold this press conference and try to become a political party. So they were trying to do two things at once, right? They were trying to compete in elections, or at least win the authorization to be able to compete in elections, and they were trying to build a dissident subculture in society based around identity, around morality, around preaching. And if you look at local activism in the 70s and the 80s, you see a whole range of previously overlooked activism. Firstly on university campuses, and then also discrete community building projects. So just after this press conference was held, the police responded by arresting the leadership of the movement. So they were arrested and jailed between 1981 and 1984. They were arrested again in 1987, and they were arrested again in 1989, and they were jailed for a long time, or they were forced into exile. That's the leadership of the movement. So thinking only about the work of the leadership, we can already see that that's going to be a bit problematic, since they spent most of the 1980s in jail. When they were in jail, you had a younger generation that took over the local branches of the movement, and they had a different kind of activism. So they were active at universities. There was still a bit more freedom to operate at universities. The universities were expanding rapidly. And in Sousse in particular, they were very active in the faculties of medicine and law. So this is a map of Sousse, thinking about the main mosques and the university faculties that they were working in the 70s and the 80s especially. This is where the Islamists were most active. And the student movement was even more resistant than the rest of the movement to this idea of becoming a political party, because they were so opposed to the existing regime. They said if we become a party, we're basically accepting and recognizing the existing authoritarian regime, and that's a mistake. So they formed their own student union. They argued for a formal break with the authoritarian regime. They were much more opposed to it. And they had many debates in their campuses with leftist students, and lots of fights. There was a lot of physical violence as well. They also organized demonstrations and public meetings. They tried to set up prayer rooms in their campuses. And then outside the university, the second new space that they developed was this secretive grassroots work in society. So this is small cells of the most loyal members of the movement, set up across the country, especially in Sousse, partly about debating the political challenges they were facing, but mostly about building a special community of like-minded people based on identity, based on morality, based on faith. And these community practices is what the movement is about at the local level in the 80s. And the bonds that they created at this moment is what enabled the movement to survive 2 decades of repression. So these kind of bonds have been described by Asif Bayat as an imagined solidarity. So that's a group of people who come together and they imagine and construct a set of common interests and shared values. So in the case of the Tunisian Islamists here, they play sports together, they build houses for each other, they pray together, they marry each other. So the main Islamist families in Sousse are all linked by marriage. And when they get married, they were changing the way marriage worked. Right, in Tunisia in the 80s, they had musical groups that were singing religious songs. They had friends who were contributing to the cost of the weddings. There was no alcohol, there was no gender mixing. It was a new symbolic practice, right? It was a new way to act in public. They're trying to separate themselves by their behavior from the rest of society. And this is very similar to the way Islamists have operated elsewhere in the Middle East, right? This is a very common approach, but it's not been talked about very much in the case of Nahda, because Nahda was always seen as more focused on formal political work. So what I want to show is that there's a lot of political activism taking place well beyond the formal leadership, and that there's a lot of ambiguity or flexibility about what the movement means. And this is really useful when the movement's in opposition, because it allows them to mobilize as many people as possible, to get as wide a range of supporters as possible, people with different priorities and different understandings of what it means to be a member of the movement. But then you get the crackdown in the late 1980s, just after those elections I described. The regime cracks down on the movement and it's effectively dismantled. And then what happens at that moment is that these different trends within the movement begin to fragment. And the problem, the ambiguity of the relationship between political and preaching ambitions and social and cultural ambitions really comes to the fore in the movement. And this is what's been described elsewhere as political learning, right? That's when a crisis, the idea is that this is when a crisis provokes a change in beliefs and practices, right? So in other words, the movement is learning from this extraordinary crisis that it's facing. Hundreds, in fact thousands of its members were arrested, hundreds of them were forced into exile. The movement was dismantled for 20 years. It didn't really exist in Tunisia. And what I want to show you is that different elements within the movement learned different things from this experience of repression in the 1990s and the 2000s. And I think that helps explain some of what's happening after 2011, after the Arab Spring. So this is a map of what this fragmentation looked like. So the movement's been dismantled inside Tunisia, and it's splitting up into these different units. So first of all, you have the leaders in exile. A lot of them came to the UK, actually. The leader, Ghanouchi, and the rest of the leadership were living in London for 20 years. Some of them were in France, some of them were elsewhere in Europe, some of them here in Belgium. These leaders in exile admitted to themselves that they'd made mistakes, right? That they'd overreached, that they pushed too hard against the regime after they did so well in those elections. In fact, they staged weeks and weeks of protests and demonstrations after the elections demanding seats in parliament. The regime never gave them the seats in parliament. They'd also failed to build any political alliances, right? They had no allies they could turn to. They were completely exposed at the moment of the crackdown. And so their idea from abroad was that there should be what they called national reconciliation with the regime. In other words, they should sit down and talk to the regime and apologise for what they did and be allowed back into the country. And this idea of reconciliation comes back again after 2011, except this time it's about being pragmatic and it's about prioritising a reconciliation with the former political elite. So in other words, what I'm saying is that they're putting political inclusion before Islamization, ahead of Islamization, right? They're prioritizing access to the political system. And then a quite different group are in prison. You have about 10,000 prisoners who are long-term prisoners in the 90s and the 2000s. They're treated very brutally when they're first arrested, but then they're sharing cells with each other and they start to debate with each other what happened, why the crackdown happened, what mistakes the movement made. They have an internal, they call it an internal evaluation. It's just an informal discussion, but they get moved around from one prison to another across the country for years. And this discussion is continuing. And they're completely opposed to the idea of reconciliation, of course, because they've been tortured by the regime, they've been held in jail, their families are really suffering. And they become very critical of the leadership of the movement. So there's one man I knew in Sousse who'd been a prisoner for 11 years. And he talked to me about the discussions he had with his cellmates in prison. He talked about how he thought that the movement had been right to take part in elections in 1989, but how it had made a mistake after those elections in pushing too hard and holding too many demonstrations against the regime. And he was angry that the leadership had not left them any way to retreat. And so after 2011, he was still within the movement. In fact, he had quite a senior position. But he was very concerned about what the movement had now become, and he said to me, are we a political movement with an Islamic background, or are we fundamentally an Islamic movement that has a political dimension? Are we a political movement with no religious dimension at all? How can we implement this for people? It needs much more reflection. And I think this is a really good example of the kind of confusion and frustration that a lot of people within the movement felt after 2011. They no longer understood what the movement was about, what it stood for, what its identity was. The problem for them was, well, how do we rebuild the movement that used to exist in the 70s and 80s, but update it for this post-Arab Spring era? Then you have these activists on the periphery, and they had a completely different experience. So they're on the periphery because they are structurally on the periphery, so they are much more junior in the movement. Most of them didn't spend a long time in jail. They're also intellectually on the periphery. They tend to have personal friendships with people from other political parties. And many of them, during these years of repression, did human rights work. So they worked in their local branch of Amnesty International or the Tunisian League for Human Rights, or they joined other opposition parties. And they became much less interested in Nahda and what it stood for, and much more interested in the kind of general debate about human rights and about democratic reforms. And what's really interesting about these people is that after 2011, they did not, as a whole, they did not return to Nahda, so they didn't rejoin the movement. So effectively, they're demobilizing away from the movement. And they want a different kind of social activism, less political, less confrontational. Then you have a very small group of young people who were trying to join the movement, even during the years of repression. And they're looking for a new religious authority, right? So they're looking for something that can offer a different understanding of Islam compared to the official Islam that they're hearing in the mosques or in their daily newspapers. And most of their debates are with the Salafists, right? Because there are a lot of Salafists beginning to emerge in Tunisia at this point. And after 2011, these young people tend to be a bit more hardline. They tend to push for more Islamization from the movement. And they want the movement to be much tougher standing up to the former regime elite. And then the vast majority of people here are socially excluded, which means that they were forced to resign from their jobs, they were forced to report to police stations, sometimes every day, sometimes 2 or 3 times a week. It made it very difficult to find jobs. And the lesson that they learned was that the movement's political ambitions had really damaged the subculture of what it meant to be an Islamist. And they went back to the original ideas about morality, about how Islamism is about morality, but in a situation where they were basically isolated. They're on their own. They can't meet with their fellow Islamists. And some of those people today really struggle to recognize what the new Nahda looks like. So these are the sort of tensions that are happening within the movement during the years of repression. And after 2011, suddenly they come into public view. So the point of this is to show you that Islamists are multivocal, right? There are all sorts of trends going on within the movement. And this is about showing how the movement rethinks its project, right? It's the debates between these different groups that explain how the movement rethinks what it stands for. This rethinking is going on inside Tunisia, has been for the last 20 years. And this intellectual rethinking happens before 2011. So it's intellectual revision before strategic change, right? So often there's a big debate about which comes first. Is it strategic change, which might be just pragmatic, or is it real intellectual change? And these debates are evidence that there's intellectual change going on well before the strategic changes that come after 2011. So the explanations that we've got, the tension between the political and preaching ambitions, this problem of fragmentation, and then finally this question of malleability, that means changeability, right? How flexible these ideas of being Islamist are. So the meaning that people give to their membership of the movement is fluid. It's reinvented all the time based on how they've experienced these years of repression. And I think that's really important because it shows us that the causal impact of religious belief, in other words, the effect that religious belief has politically, is not fixed, right? What matters is the meaning that people give to their membership of the movement. And what matters is how they interpret for themselves what it means to be Islamist. And that might change depending on the context. So I think thinking about this question of fragmentation within movements gives us some idea of how religious belief works to structure political action. And we can see that although the ideas of being Islamist in this movement are very flexible, they're not endlessly adaptable, right? So some people actually end up leaving the movement. So those peripheral activists I mentioned have basically just left the movement now. So in other words, for Nahda, the big division within the movement is not between people who are in prison and people who are in exile here in Europe. It's not between hardliners and moderates. It's not between the older generation and the younger generation. It's between people who saw the priority as political work versus those who see the priority as preaching work, as more of a socio-cultural project. And one member of the movement described this as a problem of double belonging, right? So you're belonging to, it's an ambiguous situation where you're acting like a political party, but you're also operating as a religious movement. So then we get to 2011, and the movement has to rapidly rebuild itself after 20 years of repression. The people who were the student activists in the 1980s are now leading the movement. They're leading the local offices across the country. And they want to try to rebuild the kind of community experience they enjoyed in the 70s and the 80s. And they try to set up religious study groups. They try to do exactly the same thing as they used to do when they were younger students. But it's much more difficult now, because suddenly you have the politics of the transition, you have real political competition, you have elections to run for, you have a press that's quite hostile. There are programs of internal training within the movement, they call it cultivation. But now you have this real competition from Salafist and from jihadi groups who are trying to draw young people away from Nahda. And the movement is basically distracted by the unexpected challenges of the transition. And you get three big debates emerging inside the movement. The first debate, and this is the one that gets the most attention, especially among scholars and in the press, is the question of how much Islamization the movement really wants. So in the first elections after the Arab Spring in 2011, Nahda is quite proud of its religious character. It talks about having Islam as a supreme centrist reference. But then in the years afterwards, it begins to compromise on this Islamist vision, on this Islamizing vision. So it withdraws a proposal in which it first had this idea that the Sharia should be a fundamental source of legislation. They basically have to withdraw that under pressure from opposition parties. They withdraw an idea to make blasphemy illegal. They drop a proposal to have an article in the Constitution that would make Islam the religion of state. So they're making constant concessions because of pressure from other political parties. They try to defend these concessions to their membership, but a lot of people feel that this hasn't been done properly. And so one Nahdawi in Sousse said to me, the problem in Nahda is that we let ourselves become too preoccupied with political work. Okay, so that's what's grabbed most attention abroad, but actually the biggest debate in the movement is about strategy, particularly about what do they do about the former regime, all those people that were operating in the authoritarian system and who are now trying to rebuild their political careers. These are the most difficult debates for the movement. So their first position is to say, right, the old regime party, it's called the RCD, should be made illegal, and we should have a final break with the RCD. In other words, the movement should be made illegal, and anyone who was a senior member should be banned from political life. Then they have to reverse that position. They decide that that's just impractical, and it's Rashid Ghannouchi, the founder of the movement, who leads this rethinking, and he starts to seek what he calls a consensus. So it's just like that reconciliation I pointed out that the exiled leaders were talking about in the 1990s, right? Except this time it's reconciliation with the former political elite. So here's a key example of this consensus, this reconciliation. So this is Rashid Ghannouchi, the founder of Nahda, and this is his rival, Beji Qaid Sebsi, who is a figure from the former regime who set up his own political party called Nida Tunis, the Call of Tunisia, which effectively represents the political and the business elite of the old regime. And Nahda, Ghannouchi especially, makes this decision that there needs to be a reconciliation between these two wings of Tunisian society. But his movement is very resistant to this idea. Why? Because the old regime was the force that repressed the movement, that put so many people in jail in the first place. And especially in Sousse, there's really a lot of frustration about this idea of reconciliation. So in 2014, there was an election. I took part in some of the election campaigning that the movement was doing in Sousse, and you could see that the way the local activists presented their project was completely different to this. Instead of talking about reconciliation, they talked about the need to defend the revolution of 2011, the need to prevent the old regime from coming back, and they talked about how they stood up for the oppressed, which is the same language they used 20 or 30 years earlier. They were completely out of tune with this kind of formal position of the movement, which is all about reconciliation. Why? Because they were really worried. They were angry about the return to power of the former elite, and they were worried that there would be a new round of repression. They were angry about long delays in the transitional justice process. And then after the elections in 2014, Nahda joined a coalition government with Nahda Tunis. And there was a really strong reaction against this from ordinary members within Nahda. So one Nahdawi I knew resigned his position as the head of a local office. Hamadi Jabali, who was a senior Nahdawi who'd been prime minister in 2012, resigned very publicly. Another very senior member in the movement stepped back from his senior position, and he talked about this relationship with Nahda Tunis as being a deal of the gullible, right? In other words, it was a big mistake, he argued, for Nahda to enter this coalition government with their rivals. So he calls it a deal of the gullible. And then finally you have this question about, well, what are we? Are we a religious movement or are we a political party? And as I've shown, the movement leadership made this decision to turn themselves into a political party. So this approach means that they are no longer allowing themselves, they're no longer left behind a social movement that they can retreat to in a moment of repression, which is how Islamists elsewhere in the region have operated. They've turned the whole of Nahda into a political party. This is quite a high risk. It's very hard to reverse. It's a deep commitment to politicization. It means if you want to do religious or social or cultural activism, you have to do it outside the party. You have to form your own association, or you have to join someone else's, or you have to do it as an individual. You can't do it within the party anymore. And if you're a senior preacher, you can't be a senior figure within the political party. There's also a big debate about the leadership of the movement, particularly about Ghannouchi. I was in Tunisia in January, and there was one senior member of the movement who said to me there were real problems now about Ghannouchi in the sense that he had too much power. He said, are we a movement with a president or a president with a movement? So what's interesting is that the Tunisians are not doing what Islamists in Egypt or Jordan or Morocco have done, which is to create a political party and a religious social movement. They've just become a political party, and it's a centre-right political party. So they believe in a free market economy, a limited role for the state. In fact, it's quite neoliberal in their economics. Why did they do this? Well, Ghannouchi says it's because the threat of dictatorship has gone, the threat of what he calls extreme secularism has gone, and it's partly about the movement reimagining what it means to be Islamist, but at the same time to compete for political power in a democratic system, in a civil state, not a theocratic state. So what lessons can we learn about how Islamist movements are adapting? And how much is this post-Islamism, or some sort of attempt to overcome the Islamism of the past? I think the first point is that it should be pretty obvious to all of us that there's been a real diversification in Islamist activism, right? So it's not, in the old days it used to be that the Islamist movements were really the only Islamic political actors in society. Now you have a whole range of different actors. Lots of different forms of Salafism, and then new emergent violent jihadi groups. So it's not about a failure of political Islam, it's about a diversification of Islamism. And then it's not really about Asef Bayat's idea of religiosity and rights, in other words, a kind of conceptual reimagining of Islamism, as if it's somehow more democratic or more liberal. What the Tunisians are doing are pursuing consensus more than anything. So consensus before greater democratic accountability, consensus before greater individual rights. Why do they want to pursue consensus? Well, they're worried about repression, right? They're worried about going back to the days of a one-party authoritarian state. This, they think, is their best chance of survival for the long term. So in Tunisia, they pursued this reconciliation with Nahda Tunis, the party that they were in coalition government with. That reconciliation broke down last year because Nahda Tunis is completely fragmented. And now the Islamists are pursuing reconciliation with a new political party that's just emerged, that's emerging around the Prime Minister, Youssef Chahed. It's probably going to be one of the biggest political parties. So they've changed the people they're reconciling with, but they're still pursuing this consensus approach, right, of trying to find a major political ally, a more secular political ally they can tie themselves to. It's a strategic choice. It's a way of protecting their political position. But what effect does it have? It means that Tunisia is experiencing a conservative transition, by which I mean that there's been a lot of political change. So you've had two free legislative elections and a presidential election. You have a new constitution, which is great. So you have all these major political reforms, but the social and economic reforms have hardly happened at all. And that's because when Nahda pursued this consensus approach, it's a risk-averse approach. It's a way of avoiding major change. It means they're reluctant to press for the major social and economic changes that young people were asking for in 2011 at the moment of the Arab Spring. So what examples do I have? In 2017, Nahda was in government and it supported the return of former ministers from the Ben Ali era into government. I mean, that would have been unthinkable just 5 or 6 years earlier. They also voted in favour of a law that granted an amnesty to members of the old regime who were guilty of corruption, to public officials who were guilty of corruption under the old regime. So consensus politics can be quite good because it avoids the sort of stark polarisation that we've seen in Egypt, for example, between Sisi and the Islamists. But it has a real cost. It produces a conservative bias in the transition. And it creates this impression of stability because everyone thinks it's all about a negotiated consensus. But in fact, the Tunisian transition is highly contested. There are hundreds of protests a month in Tunisia, and there have been for 5 or 6 years, against the government, right? Mostly protests from young people, mostly about jobs and about the lack of social and economic change. So there's real disillusionment among the population with this idea of consensus. And you can see that at election times as well, because election turnout is really low. The third thing that Islamism stands for at the moment in Tunisia is technocratic politics. So Nahda no longer talks, or it's diluted its religious references. It no longer pursues an Islamizing agenda. It's much more technocratic in its ideas. Let me give you an example. So this is the main election leaflet that was given out by the Nahda movement in Sousse for the elections in 2014. So these are the candidates. It's a proportional representation system. You vote for a list. I think they won the first three candidates managed to get elected. And this is their program. This is what they stand for. It says Harakat Nahda fi khidmat Sousse, so the Nahda movement in the service of Sousse. And the things that they're listing here as their kind of political manifesto are really interesting. It's all about local change. It's about improving tourism. It's about revitalising the industrial zones in the city. It's about improving public transport. It's about ending traffic jams. It's about turning the port in Tunisia into a big tourist attraction. It's about modernising the fishing industry. It's about helping farmers. So in other words, there are no issues here that are about religion or anything to do with ideology. And it feels as if it's non-ideological, but actually the movement has embraced a neoliberal project. So their idea is that the state should hardly intervene in society at all. It should have a light touch. And they're heavily reliant on international financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank for loans. So actually there's been a real convergence in the way all political parties in Tunisia think about economics. They basically all follow this quite neoliberal economic program. And when I say technocratic, what I mean is that they no longer present policies as a choice between rival positions. They think of policies as expert answers to technical challenges. So Ghannouchi himself says the goal in the movement now is to create solutions to the day-to-day problems that Tunisians face, rather than to preach about the hereafter. So you can see how much the movement has changed, how much it's lost that religious character it used to have. It used to have this transcendent vision, this comprehensive vision I talked about at the beginning. But now the new ideology it's much more worldly, and it's problem-solving, and it's technocratic. Why did they do that? Well, they're moving into the centre ground. They want to increase their vote share from their core electorate. They think that being a professional political party like this gives them more legitimacy. They think it protects them against a return to repression, against marginalisation. And a lot of them speak privately about their real fears that there will be a return to repression and they will be forced back to jail. But also political participation gives you access to resources, right? It allows you to negotiate with your political opponents, to avoid being isolated. It allows you to be seen as being professional. You can speak on TV and in the press. You can show your commitment to democracy. And I think for the movement this is especially important after what happened to the Brotherhood in Egypt in 2013, the repression of the Brotherhood, and after the growing influence that we've seen of the United Arab Emirates, who've got this very anti-Islamist agenda. But it has a cost. So there are deep disagreements within the movement about what it stands for, about this reconciliation approach, this consensus approach, disagreements about why they're not addressing the real economic problems of Tunisia, the economic problems that came out in the Arab Spring. And the other cost is their electoral support. So instead of increasing their electoral support is actually shrinking. In the elections in 2011, they won 1.5 million votes. With the next elections in 2014, they won 1 million votes. And then in local elections last year, they were down to 500,000 votes. So their vote share is really declining. So last year, at local elections, the turnout's always going to be much lower. But the pattern is a steep decline. And in other words, the Nahda project is much less ambitious than it used to be. So what are the implications more broadly about how we can think about Islamist movements? I'm trying to make the point that this offstage activism, this local activism, has an explanatory power. In other words, it can help us explain what's been going on inside the movement. It helps us understand the internal dynamics within the movement. It forces us to look beyond the public face, beyond the leadership, and to think about the tensions and the ambiguities that have been going on for decades within the movement. It encourages us to think about this idea of meaning making as being important, and how there's a competition between meanings in the movement. So the leaders of movements are very important, of course, but what's also important is the way their ideas are discussed and negotiated by the rest of the movement. What else? So a lot of work has been done arguing that Islamists have a political advantage, that they somehow have something that other political parties don't have. Either it's a reputation for good governance, or it's this enormous social welfare outreach they have that can benefit them at election time. But I think the case of Tunisia suggests that this is overstated, right? In a transition, so in other words, a moment where you have real political competition, the presumed advantage that Islamists have looks overstated. They no longer look exceptional. They are subject to competition just like every other political party. They're subject to the shifting loyalties of their voters, just like every other political party. And we know that most parties that win the first elections in a transition, the founding elections, often lose the second election. It's exactly what happened to the Islamists in Tunisia. They won in 2011, and then they lost in 2014. They came second in 2014. So in other words, Islamists are just as likely as any other political party to fail to meet these high expectations for change. And this question of fragmentation that I've talked about a lot today is not unique to the Islamists. Lots of other political parties in Tunisia are fragmenting just as much as the Islamists, in fact even more. So let's not think about Islamists as somehow exceptional. Let's just think about them as being typical political parties facing the same pressures and the same constraints as others. And then I said at the beginning that some people have said that Tunisia and Nahda especially are somehow exceptional. But I don't think that that is very useful. And I think that the debates that are going on within Nahda right now are very similar to debates happening in lots of other Islamist parties in the region, in the Middle East. So it does sound exceptional when you hear the Tunisian Islamists call themselves Muslim Democrats, not Islamists. But the PJD in Morocco calls itself a party with an Islamic reference. The Freedom and Justice Party, this short-lived party that the Brotherhood in Egypt set up after the Arab Spring, called itself a civil party with an Islamic reference. That's exactly the same phrase that Ennahda was using in 2011 before they came on to the idea of Muslim Democrats. And the AK party in Turkey call themselves conservative Democrats. There's not very much difference between them all. Other Islamist movements have set up political parties well before the Tunisians did, right? So it happened in Kuwait in 1991, it happened in Jordan in 92, it happened in Morocco in 96. And in each of those cases, the political party became much more important than the movement. And I think that's what's going to happen with Ennahda. The political party is what's going to dominate, and the religious and social cultural activism is going to take a back seat. The case of Egypt is different. So the Muslim Brotherhood was both political and religious as one movement. It created the Freedom and Justice Party after 2011, and power shifted to that party. And then at the moment of repression, the party was banned, and the power has shifted back to the movement. But what's really interesting about the Brotherhood today is that there are members of the Egyptian Brotherhood in exile who are having these same debates. Which should come first, our political ambitions or our preaching ambitions? The Jordanians are having exactly the same debate too. And I think what's striking is how often Islamists in the region are beginning to act pragmatically and to pursue technocratic programs, not ideological programs anymore. How much less ambitious their Islamism is than it used to be in the 70s and the 80s. And how it's more prosaic than this idea of post-Islamism, right? It's not as grand, it's not as ambitious as this idea of post-Islamism is sometimes explained. Instead, the characteristics that we've seen in Nahda are pragmatism, consensus, and a technocratic policy agenda. And on the key questions of minority rights, gender rights, freedom of thought, freedom of religion, lifestyle, I think this vision is still untested. It's still ambiguous. It's still untested. So I would say that the transformation that we've seen in Nahda hasn't got rid of its Islamic reference, but instead it means that Islamic reference is now being asserted as a broad cultural identity that's moulded around these ideas of consensus politics and a neoliberal technocratic agenda. And I think this is one indication of the rather ambiguous and perhaps uncertain shape of Islamism in the Middle East to come. Thank you very much.